Hello there, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of the Woman Being Podcast. I'm Emma, here with you today with my good friends Kelly and Kelly Ann.
Hi.
And we are also joined today by the inimitable Dr. Leah Tidey, who is a certified sex health educator, and she's going to talk to us about all the sexy, saucy things. Thank you for being with us today, Leah.
Yeah, I'm so excited, especially sexy, saucy things. I'm here for it.
Yes, absolutely. We're here for it, and we hope that you, dear listener, are also here for it, because we're just going to dive right in. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds.
Without expectation or judgment,
we will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
So, Leah, hello, welcome. We are so stoked to have you here, especially remotely from your car. We feel very privileged that you've taken the time out of your wonderful travels to speak with us today.
Well, and we should give you a little bit more, give the listener a little more context too.
Oh, yes.
Like, you have a podcast, you have like an influencer life, and you are currently in a Prius, which is also your home.
Which is also my home.
Temporarily.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. For the next year, this Prius is, and, you know, folks who are watching this as well, you get to see. I even tried to clean it up a little bit. It's still, you know, all of my stuff in a Prius, and it's not just me, it's also my husband. But yeah, no, I'm really happy to be here. I think it's, I mean, obviously with my job talking about sexual health, anytime folks are like, can you spend an hour with us to talk about sex? I'm like, yes. This is literally what I do. And if I happen to be in my car while we have that conversation, even better, you know?
Even better.
Even better.
Yeah. And for anyone who doesn't know, Leah has a podcast called The Love Doctor. It is really good. She has lots of great conversations on there with other people who are in the field of sexual health or who like having all these great conversations. Sometimes her husband is on there also talking about their relationship. And then she and her husband also have a YouTube channel, Levi and Leah, where you can see them travel the world in their Prius and talk about all sorts of things, not just sexuality and sexual health, but like life. So you guys should check them out.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the shameless plug. I love
You're
that.
welcome. Speaking of shameless plugs, you should also follow us on Instagram.
While you're there.
Yeah. So go follow Levi and Leah, and then follow Woman Being Podcast if you're not already. And you can find us we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok, we're on YouTube, we're on all the podcast platforms, pretty much. If we're not on a podcast platform, tell us, because we want to be on it. But Leah, let's get into the meat of this. Could you just give us a little introduction to who you are, what you do, and also how you got into this topic of exploring sexuality and sexual health, and like why do you do what you do?
Yeah. That's such a great question. And I feel like when I go into like schools, like I teach folks of all different ages of sexual health, that's usually the first question that kids ask me. Usually like grade 7s are like, why is this your job? Yeah. Usually they're trying to like trip me up. They're like, who's this weird lady talking to me about sex? I'm like, guys, I have the best job ever. But to give some context to that, I completed my PhD back in 2020 in drama education. And I focused that on sexual health specifically. So I worked with older adults and with youth, and we created a play about their experiences of like sexuality, figuring out your gender identity, new relationships, old relationships. And I learned a ton from that of really, we have far more in common than we have that is different, even with folks who are 16 and folks who are, I think the oldest person I've worked with is 90.
Wow.
And it's amazing the similarities that come up across those age groups. So during that process, I worked with a sexual health educator who has been one of my mentors for years, Jennifer Gibson. And I was like, I also want to have your job. Like, I want to be the theater person, but I want to be the sex educator. So I finished my certification last year, even though I've kind of been like, not certified, but teaching sex ed or having these conversations for several years. And I just find that every time I have these conversations with people, like, or I tell someone that I'm a sexual ed educator, everyone has an opinion. They have something they want to say to me, whether it's like, oh, can you look at this thing? I'm like, no, I'm not that kind of doctor. I can't assess that for you. Yeah. Right? Or just people telling me all sorts of intimate details about their lives because they just don't know who else to turn to. It's a gift, but it's definitely something that you got to set a lot of boundaries around, like, okay, you're going to get real intimate with me right now. And I don't know if I'm ready for that.
That's incredible. And getting to hear a bit about where you're coming from is super helpful, I think.
Well, so there's this concept that you talk about a lot as it relates to, I think everyone's familiar at this point with sexual orientation, but there's this term that we've heard from you called relational orientation. And so, of which you have on both sides, interesting perspective.
Yeah.
As a bisexual woman in a polyamorous marriage, would you be willing to share how you discovered your sexual and relational orientation? And can you unpack a little bit about what that means?
Definitely. I think that's such an interesting part where, like you said, we are taught early on about what a sexual orientation is. And quite often we're just taught, okay, you're straight or you're gay. I'm like, that's it. And from a young age, I kind of knew that wasn't really for me. I was like, whoa, but like guys are really cute. I'm like, also girls are really cute. And I'm like, how do I feel about that? So I was 12 when I figured out that I was bisexual. But it wasn't really until, and for folks who are listening, bisexual, some people will use the term pansexual as well. It means that you're attracted to multiple genders. So for me, I could be attracted to a man or a woman or someone who's non-binary or transgender. Really, I like people instead of their genders. But then I didn't figure out that I was polyamorous as an identity, like a relational orientation, until really in the last year has that been something that's really stuck with me, even though my husband and I have been in a non-monogamous relationship now for over 3 years now, 3.5 years. Yeah. And I will say it's not for the faint of heart. There's the great thing there's all these jokes around polyamory, around if you wanted to have sex with multiple people, then you would just do that. You would cheat. I'm not saying that cheating is a good thing to do, but some people would do that. If you want to have a lot of really intimate, soul-searching conversations, then you're into polyamory, because trust me, there's way more talking than there is sex, and that's for a good reason, because you want to do it in a consensual and an ethical way.
Sure.
So when we talk about that relational orientation, as opposed to just our sexual orientation, it's what kind of relationship do I envision for myself? Do I imagine one partner who I share everything with, like we share our finances and we have a family together, we live together? Or do you have, numerous intimate relationships? And I've talked on my podcast before and brought on a lot of leading experts around polyamory and consensual non-monogamy. And one of them, Dr. Amy C. Moores, she's fantastic and just such a lovely person. But she talks about how, we don't judge people who have multiple friends, like close, intimate relationships, right? Like I would say, I have a close relationship with my mother, I have a close relationship with some of my best friends, and everyone's like, oh, that's great. Like, look at your social circle, how rich and diverse that is. But as soon as there's a romantic or sexual element, there's all sorts of rules and ideas that people have saying that that's wrong. So I definitely internalized that for a long time, and it took me a lot of therapy and a lot of crying to be like, oh, I'm not broken. Like, the fact that I have the capacity to love and care for multiple people in this way, that's okay. That's okay to be that way.
Yeah, it's definitely, it makes sense that it would take a lot of sort of breaking down the things that we've been taught, right? Like we're told that a relationship looks a certain way. We're told that, sex is between a man and a woman. We're told that a relationship must be monogamous. I actually was listening to a scientist who was talking about how on the scale of like monogamy to non-monogamy, essentially, like human beings are like sort of somewhere in the middle in terms of our sort of from an evolutionary perspective is what he was coming at it from. And so people are like inclined towards monogamy, but also inclined towards having multiple partners, and it could vary across the board. And so that was super fascinating to hear that from a purely scientific perspective. And I think that obviously there's variations person to person because we're more complex than just, what we're told we are from an evolutionary standpoint. But it's fascinating to think about. And I am interested to hear a little bit about, you said that you and your husband were in a non-monogamous relationship, but you didn't consider yourself polyamorous. What would you say is like the difference there? Or was it like a choosing the word for it? Or was it, what does that mean?
No, that's really good to ask, because I think if you're in the polyamory world, oh my gosh, you can get caught up in all sorts of language, and I love language. Language is power, so it's really important that we're, specific about what we're using. So you'll see, it's so funny. Like I feel like everyone who's on Tinder right now, they're like, everyone says E&M or C&M, and what does that mean? I don't really get it. So E&M is like ethical non-monogamy or consensual non-monogamy. There's debate about those sorts of things because there's the idea that if you say non-monogamy without the ethical or the consensual in front of it, that it is like clearly unethical or unconsensual. So for us, I would say we were in kind of that consensual, ethical, non-monogamous thing where the primary relationship was still my husband and I. We were, experimenting what that would look like to not necessarily be in relationships with other people, but to have, really open conversations about, we would like to have like a sexual experience together and what could that look like. And I don't think it was until a bit later when I, started reading more about polyamory and, I'd read these books and I would just cry because I'd be like, wow, like this is who I am. Like from a young age, I felt like I could care for multiple people in this kind of deep, intimate way. And was just always kind of told, not even like overtly, but just, like those subtle, insidious messages in society that like, that was wrong. It wasn't anything really overt from a young age, but I don't think I really had the confidence in myself and in my sexuality until my late 20s, and now I'm 30, to be like, oh, I can claim this identity, and that doesn't mean I'm like a bad person or a deviant person or anything like that. It just means that this is who I am, and whether I was born that way, whether it was something that, I learned and developed as I grew, like whichever, the point is that this is who I am now. And unfortunately, I think folks, from all walks of life, but I think women in particular, we are taught, am I allowed to swear?
Oh, yes, for sure.
Okay.
Swear away.
Okay, good. I just wanted to check,
Yeah.
But yeah, we're taught a lot of bullshit about our bodies and about who we should love and how we should give up everything for other people, and our only value is our relationships to others instead of valuing the relationships with ourselves. And I had to unpack a lot of that in my 20s, and I think a lot of us do. And I feel very fortunate to have had the time and space to do that. And a partner who was like, you know what? Like I'm definitely like into us having multiple relationships, multiple partners. This is great, but like this is fundamentally like who you are. Like I see this in you, and I think he was able to really express that in something that I was kind of afraid to admit to myself. So having a strong support network, whether that's a partner or a friend, a loved one, whichever, like that really helped as well. And just kind of finding who you are.
Absolutely. And I can't imagine, like, I feel like maybe non-monogamy or polyamory in general is starting to get a little bit more traction. Like, it's maybe I've just been unaware of that community in general, but I can't imagine trying to unpack that a few years ago, right?
Yeah.
Or like, I think you mentioned in your early 20s. So I really commend you for doing that work and advocating for yourself in that way, because I would imagine that's not the easiest journey, especially because relational orientation is so cultural, right? And like you mentioned, like you weren't a sexual deviant or whatever. Like, it's like, no, I am just a whole person that is created this way or that has been born this way. And that's really all there is to it. And that's acceptable. So like from a self-advocate perspective, I really like admire that. And I'm really curious, as you discovered that and went on that journey, like what has the integration looked like as you've moved that part of your life more front and center? How have you like worked that out practically, especially with a spouse? What does that look like?
Oh, wow. That's, remember what I said before about how you spend a lot of time talking and soul searching? I mean, it's like you think that you've talked through this idea or this feeling, and you're like, actually, we got to talk about it again and again. So I don't think I can reiterate enough the importance of like that constant communication. I don't want it to sound trite. Like, I think when I'm telling people about sexuality in general, I'm like, we need to learn to communicate. And that doesn't mean like one conversation of like, this is my sexual orientation, these are my likes and dislikes, excellent, now we're good to go. It's like ongoing conversations about who we are and what that's going to look like. And really with polyamory, Levi and I have had a lot of conversations about how public we are with that. I'm pretty open with the fact that I'm bisexual, that I identify as queer, but I'm also in a position where that's not going to impact my hireability. Like, I work at the University of Victoria, and I think in the field that I'm in, it's almost an asset, right? Because I'm talking to there are a lot of queer kids at UVic. And so like, I'm like, that's great. I can talk to you about the resources that I have accessed myself in this city. But polyamory is still, it's on the fringes. And I think you're right. Like, it's getting more traction for sure. And it's kind of like there's celebrities who are now polyamorous, like Willow Smith is talking about being polyamorous, right? Like, so it's kind of like, it's in the zeitgeist. People are talking about it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that like day to day people are like super down with that. So I think we toe the line where in the podcast, I feel like I have a bit more autonomy to talk about that more openly, or if I'm having personal conversations with people. But on our YouTube channel, we kind of like allude to it a little bit, but not as much, because we still want to be accessible to lots of different people. And, I don't want to make people feel like this isn't a space for them as well. Yeah, like it's kind of a fine line of trying to make sure that you're honoring who you are while also like, people have preconceived ideas about it. And so if you can like, we're like, look at us, we're a nice straight seeming couple. And then like, it's like the queer agenda, man. Like, the more they hang out with us, we're like, yes, we're also bisexual and also queer. Did we mention? And they're like, but these people seem nice. And I'm like, we are. Isn't that amazing? So just deconstructing stereotypes bit by bit, but you got to kind of lure them in first.
Yeah, that's hard work though. That's hard work.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, and I also imagine like with you having like a public presence, there's that balance of like things that you keep for yourself versus things that you share, like you guys share your lives in so many ways. Like, you're vlogging and talking about like your relationship so much that it must be like an interesting line to walk, as you figure out how much to share versus what do you want to just keep to yourselves.
Absolutely. Right. And we're very particular too about like, you know, we've had a couple of long-term partners and we don't share their names or anything else about them because, you know, their job isn't influencers. Like they don't, not that we're like insanely famous that people are going to like hang out outside their door and get paparazzi photos. Like that won't happen by any means. But yeah, like, you know, you don't want to take away that choice from them either, right? That's
Sure.
for me, that whole ethical and consensual piece of just doing it in the best way possible, and really honoring, even if someone says, oh, that's fine, and then checking in again, being like, are you sure? Like so much of I could go into a whole thing about consent, but really, how are we making sure that we're showing up for people and giving them the space to say no, even if like their bodies are saying no, but they've said yes. I'm like, okay, let me just pause for a second because you're giving me different signals than what you just said. So I'm going to, let's like reevaluate again. So learning how to, I don't know, re-listen to yourself and to others and not force the public life onto anyone who didn't sign up for that.
For sure.
Yeah. I really admire that though. And so much of what you've mentioned of how to be accessible, like, hey, we're not scary, we're normal, we're cool people, but also like that advocacy space or even like that consent space of like potential other partners, like that's all very valuable. And as you've been kind of talking about that, two things stick out. One is your ethics, right? And then the other is potential assumptions. So I feel like a lot of people assume a lot of things about what polyamory is or isn't. And I think one of the important things is your ethics and how you show up to your space, your sex life, your relationships. And so I'm really curious to know how you form your sexual ethic or what that looks like in your own life.
That's so good. Your sexual ethic. It's one of those things where like you develop, but then you're like, okay, like how would I actually describe this? So in terms of my own like sexual ethic, I feel like it's something that's evolving, and that's kind of what ethics is, right? The more that you learn and discover, you know, viewpoints different than your own, the more you can, I don't know, maybe address certain situations with more grace, with more understanding. And so knowing that having like a strict code of ethics, that's not really it. It's being able to understand the gray areas and know that if you are going about it in a good way, in a kind way, in a caring way, if that's what's guiding you, then probably you're doing okay. But when you mess up, even with those good intentions, like kind of admitting like, oh man, like I fucked up, like I crossed a boundary and I didn't mean to. And unfortunately in our experience, and this has happened to a lot of other folks that I've talked to who are polyamorous, is that boundaries are crossed. They are. And you can get triggered by, you know, your partner, by their reactions to certain things. You know, like say if you start dating someone new, and you get caught up in new relationship energy. This is a thing that's like the NRE, new relationship energy, and anyone can feel new relationship energy, right? And you want to spend all of your time with that person and you're kind of infatuated, and then you can kind of forget those other partnerships that you have. So you really need to be aware of not only your own emotions and trying to honor that, but also honor how that's going to impact the other people in your life. And in terms of the sexual ethics and polyamory as well, there's a lot of interesting ideas around like power, right? And not having like veto power over a partner. You know, if they want to go and have an experience with another partner, well, the two of them are in a relationship and you're a part of that, but like you don't get to necessarily have a say about, okay, now you can say this and do that, right? Because you're really infringing on someone else's autonomy. Like you need to be able to come to a place where I trust that we are all going to act with integrity, and that doesn't mean that we're not going to mess up and not going to like talk about it and take responsibility for our actions. But fundamentally, we hope, 80, 90% of the time, we're always acting with that integrity. So when we do mess up, there's a foundation of trust there that we can rebuild. I don't know. Did that make sense? I feel like I threw around a lot of words.
No,
Like,
that makes sense a lot. I think like it's making me think of our friendship. Actually, like we're 3 friends. We've grown very close over the last couple of years doing this podcast and also just like hanging out, working in a lot of the same workplaces, etc. And making space for our relationship together as like not a threesome. That's the wrong word. But
this isn't that kind of podcast.
Like hold on. Spoiler alert, everybody. No,
this is where we announce our relationship.
We knew it. Dang.
But yeah, sort of our tri-relationship. But then also cultivating our one-on-one relationships with each other and balancing that and trying to create space for like my one-on-one with Kelly and Kelly's one-on-one with Emma and me not having to insert myself into all of that and vice versa, if that makes sense. So
absolutely.
It makes sense to me, like in terms of like a friendship way, I can kind of understand the balance in having sort of like 3 people involved in something, but also space for single 2-person relationships and not overstepping.
Because even in, say there's 3 people in a relationship, there's really, I'm trying to do the math real quick, there's really like 4 relationships happening. It's like, like me and partner A and partner B, those 2 together, what the relationship is with all 3 of us. That's its own relationship where, the 3 of you all have kind of equal say when it's the 3 of you together. But when you break off into duos or whatever that is to be, like, just knowing that dynamic is ever changing. And one major thing that Levi and I are still grappling with, and this another like kind of polyamory term is called couples privilege. And so a lot of the time you'll hear about like people talk about like unicorn hunting, and it's like straight-ish couples potentially with like a bisexual or a queer woman who's like, we really want to like have an experience with another woman. And they don't care at all about who that other woman is. Like they're fulfilling some sort of sexual fantasy. And I'm like, if you want to fulfill a sexual fantasy, then hire and pay for a sex worker. Like get someone who that is their profession. They will do it well. They will fulfill this fantasy for you. Make sure that, like all sorts of ethics around sex work, but make sure that that's what you're going to do. But this person, like, what are they getting out of this relationship? Is this a fantasy that they have?
Sure.
Yeah. So just really being aware that who is this other person in a relationship, but also your relationship, like say if you're a couple and then you open up your relationship to other people, it's knowing that your relationship with the other person doesn't have to be the same. Levi is not going to have the same relationship with a partner that I will to that partner because you're going to be intimate on different levels or have different similarities or differences. And that's something that's hard to unpack. It's not like the 2 of us have a relationship with this person. It's like, well, no, it's way more complex than that. And sometimes you don't fully realize it until you're in that relationship and you're like, oh, wow, this is complicated.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really important point, though, when you talked about within a sexual ethic, like giving the space to also reconcile when a line has been crossed. I think that when people talk about ethics or morality, there's often this idea that like if you break those ethics or if you do something that's crossing a line, that you are like a hypocrite or that you are really like vile in some way. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to recognize that people are fallible, that people are going to mess up, that people are going to make mistakes. And part of your ethic is also having the ability to apologize or to recognize when things were done in a way that didn't quite line up with the ethic that's more your ideal, And I think that should be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's this kind of idea, like if, someone has wronged you or some way or crossed a boundary, instead of, and sometimes that is like irreparable. You're like, all right, you've crossed a pretty severe boundary for me, and that's kind of the end of that. And absolutely the autonomy to do that. But in any relationship that you are in, if it's a long-term intimate relationship, like with family, with friendships, like your boundaries are they're going to be crossed, and it's how we deal with them that I think
Yeah.
is going to be really important, right? And to me, that
sure.
comes, like this idea around like restorative justice. What do we then do to make sure that we come out of this? Like, maybe we've been really badly like hurt. We've been wounded by someone else's actions. What are we going to do to not just apologize, but what are the reparations and the things that we're going to do to, not even to make up for our actions, but moving forward, what will that look like?
That requires a lot of humility.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially when you're the one that fucks up. You're like, no, what? I feel like as a sex educator, I feel extra bad because I'm like, man, I should know this stuff. And
You're like,
yeah, but
I'm the professional.
yeah. But I'm like also a very like, complex human being. I'm like,
Yeah.
damn. So I'm trying to be kind to yourself too. But yeah, it's a lot of work.
I'm just like, what an interesting opportunity to get to know yourself deeper through that experience. And then also to get to know your spouse deeper through that experience. Like, and I like what you said earlier. It was implying like, that basically you don't have ownership over your spouse as a person and they don't have ownership over you, which I think coming from a conservative Christian culture, it's like, oh, to have and to hold, like, you are mine now, and I think that's something now as, 5 years into marriage and like deconstructing that we're like, what does that look like? You don't own me and I don't own you. And like that's a whole can of worms that's so liberating, but also confusing. And so I love that you we're like, yeah, like we have autonomy in this. And so anyway, there's just so much I feel like to learn and unpack. But I'm curious also to know, pertaining to anything from like bisexuality to polyamory or being in a straight passing relationship, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you've come across about queer people? Like in your whole situation, in your whole life.
In your whole life, from birth till now, tell me.
Just list them out.
In order. Go.
Yeah. How much time you got? Like, let's see. It's so interesting. Like, I feel like the queer community and like the LGBTQ plus, and we could go on all of the different, really valid identities that are in that plus as well. We make this assumption that like the queer community is kind of like, well, we all love each other because we all need rights. And we're like, well, there's actually a lot of tension, and this is not a sweeping statement, but there can be a lot of tension between lesbian women and gay men because gay men have primarily had better representation, more resources, less stereotypes around them. So there's all sorts of interesting nuance even within the queer community and not just from, heterosexuals and straight passing folks kind of making assumptions within that. So folks who are bisexual, we kind of get the shit end of both sticks, quite honestly, because if when I was younger and said I was bisexual, there are a lot of people who are like, well, she's actually a lesbian and just won't admit it. Right? And don't get me wrong, like I love women. I've been in relationships with other women, and if I were to end up in a long-term relationship, like if I hadn't married Levi, I may just have likely have married a woman, and that's fine. I still would have been bisexual though, because the flip side of that is a lot of other folks are like, well, she's actually a straight girl, but like wants to get guys' attention by like kissing a girl at like a party or something, right?
Yeah.
So
Dang.
it's kind of, sometimes people like, they'll make the assumption that people who are bisexual are, and I'm using little bunny ears, are fence sitters. We just we got to pick a side or choose a lane.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's hard. And so there are a lot of women in my exact situation. Like, you only have to go on TikTok for, I don't know, everyone has their own TikToks, but you go on my TikTok for like 2 seconds and you see a lot of bisexual queer women in straight passing relationships who really just don't know where they fit in the world because they want to go to Pride and they live their life in a what they would see as like a queer way, but the world wouldn't necessarily see them in that way. So you're like, well, do I fit in this straight world that, really, I would say even most straight people don't fit into because we have really rigid rules about what our relationship's supposed to look like. So I don't know. Whenever I tell people that I'm bisexual, I've had many conversations, and I don't want to make assumptions about older white men. However,
I mean, this is the place to do that.
but that's most of the people online and in person who've been like, but you're married to Levi. Like, aren't you like formerly bisexual and now you're straight? And that exact phrase has been used so many times that I just like, actually, it's so strange. Like, if someone was straight and they were single, right? And I'm like, oh, so what? Now are you asexual because you're not in a relationship with someone else right now?
Yeah.
Like, there's just there's weird things. Or if someone, and I'm like, if you're straight and then you're single, I'm like, well, now are you an incel? That would probably be more, they'd maybe find that really offensive. But,
they're being offensive too. And it's turning that logic around and showing how it's actually pretty flawed.
Yeah, exactly. So, our sexualities are so much more expansive than just who we're in a relationship with, who we have sex with, who we're attracted to. Like, it's hugely complex. And I invite my students, I teach a 3rd year sexual health class. And one of our first classes, I teach them this theory about, sexual configurations. And I get them to color and they map out their sexuality. They don't share that with anyone else, but they just draw, like, this is who I am, and like, this is the first time I maybe felt sexual attraction to another person. Or maybe I've never felt sexual attraction to another person, but they start thinking about, like, what kind of erotic relationships do I want? What kind of intimate relationships do I want? And it just gets them to get outside of, like, sex and, like, just thinking about the gender of whoever you're attracted to, because we know it's so much more expansive than that. And as soon as you open your mind up to those things, oh man, it's so much more fun and interesting, and you just realize how rich and complex we all are.
Yeah.
Cool. Speaking of kind of how you form sort of like sexuality and the thought process behind it with your students, I'm thinking of the many like people that listen to our podcast that are Christian, deconstructing Christian, or deconstructed Christian. We all come from a very traditional monogamous understanding of sex and marriage and relationships and all that. And so my question is, like, do you encounter people like that a lot? And how do you help, or what are the things that are most beneficial, you think, to people who kind of come from this sort of very singular traditional background?
I won't say that I have personal experience having like that kind of upbringing. My father's side is Anglican, but like the Anglicans they're like, yeah, like we're down with gay marriage. That's kind of cool. But still very much like marriage and family like values and, being married, marriage is, for them, they can think more than just a man and a woman, but still very much that monogamy centric thing.
Yeah.
But I have had countless students and listeners of the podcast who come from more of, I would say like purity culture, because I would say from, all sorts of different walks of life and religious backgrounds, but that purity culture seems to be the main thing.
Yeah.
I think the thing that kind of bothers me about that, and it's not necessarily like, if you're a monogamous person, that's fantastic. Like, polyamorous people aren't out here to be like, everybody should be polyamorous.
Yeah.
We'd have a bigger dating pool, which would be great. But because sometimes if you're in a small community, slim pickings.
For sure. Well, and there's the idea, I think people get afraid actually that like people in the LGBTQ plus space are like trying to convert people there's like when people balk their heads at the idea of their kids being educated about this in school. They're like, well, what if my kid winds up being gay because of that? And it's like, that's not going to make your child gay. That's not actually how that works. So there's definitely that idea.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the idea that like education can somehow like make people gay or straight, you're like, I mean, if that was the case, we've been trying to educate everyone to be straight for a very long time,
Yes.
especially in like white, colonial, Eurocentric, you can add all sorts of things onto that. But like in that patriarchal view, we have been trying to like beat the idea of, you know, heteronormativity for years. And it hasn't worked because like queer people, we're born everywhere into every culture and religion and skin color. And like, we're just are who we are. And so, you know, if that actually worked, nobody would be gay. So sorry.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a really good point.
It doesn't work the other way around. But I think the root of that kind of, that purity culture and that idea that there is only one way to properly be in love or be in a relationship, that's all for me based in shame. And shame's just, I mean, I talk a lot about shame. I've done some research about shame of just, we create these cycles of it. And especially with young women, as soon as we teach them that their bodies are something to be shameful of, like the way their bodies are changing or if they're experiencing menstruation and, you know, like we are taught shame from such a young age. And then you layer in, you know, shame in terms of like race or sexual orientation or socioeconomic status. It just gets so complicated. Yeah. But like, why though? Like, why is that the basis of that? Like, we use shame as a way to like, it's a regulatory device of like, well, if we can make people think that there's only one normal way and shame them into being anything else, that doesn't actually work. People just end up feeling really terrible about themselves and then hopefully later on figure out that that's not the case for them and have to go to a lot of therapy to deal with that. Like,
yeah, that's one of the things about purity culture that I think we've sort of, I don't know, uncovered over the years doing this podcast and talking to each other is this kind of like the intent is so rigid and so specific. And from the perspective of, I think, a lot of Christian leaders is for people's good. But then when you look at pardon my Christian language, the fruit of this teaching, you have a lot of like trauma. You have a lot of internalized like shame. You have people who can't have sex. You have people who can't orgasm. You have people who like don't know how to enjoy sex or how to enjoy sex with their partner. Yeah. You have marriages that are like dry, you know, all sorts of struggles.
Or in the worst forms, abusive.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so you're looking at like this sort of ethic that is trying to enforce itself upon all these young people, and then the fruit of it being so harmful. Mm-hmm. It's like, is that really for anyone's benefit?
Yeah. You really hit the nail on the head there. And I love that, pardon my Christian language, that just gave such a delighted kind of giggle. I'm like, wow, that's just, I'm going to start like quoting The Handmaid's Tale or something. Like, it's just, you know, like clearly that's not the fruit. Yeah, I always wanted to be like, blessed be the fruit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wasn't being ironic either. That's the thing.
That is it.
Yeah.
That is it. I actually hear that verbiage pretty regularly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is just a while. I'm just kind of like grappling with that. But it's really cool to hear that has been so much a part of, I mean, maybe cool isn't the right word. Sucks that you have to do that work, but really amazing. And when the four of us, I was about to say the three of us, I can count three of you and me. But when we first connected, then I, listened to the podcast, I was like, wow, like there's some real deep critical thinking and like deep work about knowing yourself and having to get through all of that stuff that doesn't serve you. That's hard. That's hard work, especially when it's so rooted in your community. Like, poof.
Yeah. I mean, and you've had a similar journey and kind of overcoming a cultural norm that transcends Christianity and goes beyond just sort of one small community ethic and sort of serves this larger narrative of both bisexuality and polyamory, kind of stepping outside the norm and being a part of something that is more taboo, but for you is the truest version of yourself. And I think, that's incredibly difficult and incredibly hard work. Yeah. So it's good stuff.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. We're all doing so good.
We give ourselves a little pat on the back for that.
Absolutely. Just got
On my
to
sweaty little
sometimes.
back.
This has just popped into my brain because we were literally talking about it this morning. And I just really have to know / want to know your opinion on the Kinsey scale, which for the listener, if you don't know what the Kinsey scale is,
You should listen to our episode with Mike Maeshiro
You
because we
have
talk
to
about it
listen.
in that a little bit.
Just a little plug there.
it's really good. But it's essentially the idea that there's a very, very, very small percentage of people that are 100% straight and 100% gay. You can correct me if I'm misquoting, Leah. And then there's a large range in the middle of sexual expression and sexual identity. And we were kind of chatting casually on a casual Saturday about the positives of something like that, of the concept of that, and then also the potential negatives of the impact of something like that. And I just, as the expert in the room, I had to ask you.
The sexpert, you might
The
say.
sexpert.
Ooh.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, we owe a great deal to Kinsey, to Alfred Kinsey, and there's somebody else. I know Alfred Kinsey for sure, and the whole Kinsey Institute around their sex research. Like, they were doing some pretty progressive stuff, like, early in the 1900s. So, kudos to them. Yeah, I think the Kinsey scale, some people will talk about it as like a spectrum, right? It was pretty groundbreaking at the time, when he first proposed this. This was like a big deal. And people were like, what? Like, that's so wild that all of these people may exist in this, like, we're half straight, half gay in the middle here. There's kind of two things that I think about for that. I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with that scale, right? Like, I think it's, especially in the time that it was created, I'm like, that's pretty intuitive to think about how we could express our sexuality. But as someone who's bisexual, it's not that I necessarily think of myself as like, all right, I'm 50% straight and I'm 50% gay. I'm just 100% bisexual. And that means something different day to day, right? And a lot of people who are questioning if they are bisexual or not, they're like, well, I feel like I'm more attracted to men than I am to women. So am I really bisexual? I'm like, yeah, like, we're not out here, like, with scientific checkbooks or whatever being like, okay, well, like, out of 5 times out of 10 do you have erotic thoughts about men, and if it's 6 times, you're gay. It can't, it fluctuates, right? So it's different. And so one way that I really like, and I can't take credit for this, is Action Canada is a great nonprofit in Canada that talks about the sexuality galaxy. And I just love, it's kind of like for kids, it's a bit kitschy, but it's very cute. And they have like a little image of a rocket ship, and then you can just explore the galaxy of where you might be. So it's not like there's an endpoint of like, it's straight or gay, and those are far different from each other, because the whole point in sexuality is that we probably have a lot more in common than we do have different. And if we're all in this same galaxy, but we can just, you're polyamorous, you're queer, you're bisexual, but maybe you're also like, you're into like, I don't know, like BDSM, or maybe you're not. Like, there's just all sorts of other things that you might be interested in. That's so much more than just, are you straight or are you gay, and where are you on that thing? So I like to think that, but we wouldn't have gotten to the idea of the galaxy without the idea of the scale.
Sure.
So, right.
No, that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for answering that question, because I was just curious, and we had some musings this morning, and I was like, I bet Leah has a great opinion about this. And of course you do.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I think that one of the potentials we had talked about was the potential for sort of like essentially gay erasure from something like the Kinsey scale, and saying, well, if everyone's a little bit gay, then like your plight as someone who's like been like ostracized in society or hasn't been given like adequate rights or what like has like been bullied or whatever because of your sexuality, that doesn't really matter because everyone's a little bit gay, so that's not really why. And that's obviously an extreme, but people do that with race, with gender, and with sex and everything. And so but there's always potential to abuse a tool that even is a helpful tool.
I mean, the world, probably, I mean, I don't know. Sometimes I'll like make jokes in my classes about like, well, who is straight these days? Who's 100% straight? You know,
Yeah.
like, have you seen the beautiful people in the world? How could you not be a little gay? So, you know, like I'll talk about, you know, like Harry Styles versus, you know, and I'm like, come on, dudes, like, how could you not be like, wow, amazing? Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point too, where it kind of, you know, being gay, being queer is about a lot more than just your sexual orientation. It's a lot about community as well. And so, you know, even people who, you know, you don't have to be a really outspoken queer person to still know that you are queer. But but I also have the feeling that, like, I think there are some people who are like, yes, like I am queer. And I'm like, that's great. But a part of, to me, about that queer label is there's a political and an activist part of that too, where when you feel safe to do so, you know, or depending on how you go about that, you know, addressing people's stigmas or misconceptions, that's a part of that. Showing up for your community and not letting other people, whether it's partners or friends, you know, kind of say homophobic things or whatever. Like, you need to show up in that way if you want to claim to be a part of that community as well. Like, that's something that I think is important as well for allies, for all sorts of folks. Like, you know, you hear shitty things people say and you're like, that's not okay.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I think like is a pro for the Kinsey scale is I think if we had more cis hetero men thinking they might be just a little gay, think about like how much kinder we would all be to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
You know,
Well,
like it was sort of, you know, there is sort of like a stigmatization in that idea.
Yeah.
But I can understand both sides. But it is fascinating to think about and talk about.
absolutely.
So speaking of sort of like the communal aspect of being part of the queer community and all that comes with that, obviously you and your husband Levi are traveling North America right now. You are
Welcome to America.
Yes, welcome to the United
So glad
States.
to have you here.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm in your home state. I am in California. It was very close to your
Yes.
home not that long ago. So
I know. We were like ships in the night. We
know.
crossed and did not collide, but that's okay. That's okay.
One
Maybe
day.
we'll be in Victoria one day.
you would be welcome anytime. Anytime.
Amazing. But you guys are traveling North America, living out of your Prius. Very cool. I'm very jealous. But I'm curious to hear about just how your sexuality and you guys' just relationship has intersected with this experience. And what it looks like to like be traveling in spaces that may be more queer and also maybe less queer as you go to various vastly different parts of this continent. What does that look like for you?
It's so interesting because I feel like where we live in Victoria, in Canada, it's a bit of a queer mecca. Like we have one of the highest rates of queer women who live there, just like the highest population. I think it's like per capita, like we have the most women in the city, you know,
Wow.
than like anywhere else in Canada. So women like to live there. Queer women like to live there. Trans women like to live there. Trans folks in general. I think we have some of the highest rate per capita of transgender folks who also live in Victoria. Which is a really amazing thing. So I feel like we kind of exist in this happy little queer bubble. But right now I'm reading a really great book called Real Queer America. And the author is a transgender woman who grew up in Provo, Utah, part of the Mormon Church.
Oh, wow.
Which is just fascinating to hear, to hear about her experience.
Yeah.
And, you know, is now married to another woman, and I think they live in Atlanta now. But she goes on this road trip with a friend of hers through all of these kind of, middle America. Well, people would, like, quote unquote, call the flyover states. And they're like, oh, like, the queer rights here are terrible. Like, don't go there. And she's finding all of these hidden gems of how when you are in adversity, you kind of have to come together as a community. Like, we can't fight amongst each other because we need to all stand together. And I'm kind of like feeling that here. Like, even though I, come from a place that's very liberal, it would be very easy for me to go about my day and be like, oh, well, there's somebody else who's doing the work. There's other people who are talking about queer rights, so I don't really have to do that today because, I'm tired or I got to do something else. But on this road trip, I feel like anytime I'm having a kind of a conversation with someone, I'll kind of test the waters by telling them that I'm a sexual health educator. I'll gauge how that reaction goes first. It's interesting, the reactions. But then I'll also, like on my water bottle, like it's pretty clear that I'm queer. Like, there's rainbow stickers on it. I literally just got a sticker the other day of like a flower vulva thing. Like, it's
amazing.
I need
so,
one.
it's so amazing. I'm missing all of my beautiful vulva art that's usually at my house, but the stickers are helping. But I'm finding, every one-to-one conversation that I've had with Americans, and again, I can't say like Americans broadly, but has been so lovely, like really kind, thoughtful people. And probably about half of them politically, I probably don't agree with some of, their viewpoints. Sure. But, they're perfectly kind to me in that moment. But I feel like it'll be interesting when we go to Mexico as well, of how open we are, because I have so much privilege, and, I can walk down the street and hold my husband's hand and no one looks at me twice. Yeah. And they're like, there's this nice straight lady, and plus we're white. Like, we're a white straight passing couple. Like, there is so much like privilege and unearned privilege in all of that, that my experience so far has been really, really calm. But I will say the cool thing that I'm really looking forward to is we're going to go to San Francisco next week, which is like,
oh boy,
a queer mecca.
That is
and I'm like,
nice.
yes. I'm like, I'm going to get my gay on. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to I'm going to cuff my jeans and show off my arm tattoo, and, I'll do the whole thing.
Go to some gay bars, maybe.
Yes, exactly.
There's some places.
There's going to be some good spots. But then, and then a week later, we're going to go to Provo, Utah.
Wow.
Because I want to see what the deal is. I mean, we also want to go to some of the national parks. I want to go to Moab, see some of that beautiful scenery there. But, there's a really small but strong queer community in Provo, which is like this like heartland of Mormonism, like especially Utah. So I'm just so excited to see that juxtaposition, because America, what a beautiful, strange place, right? Like,
it really is.
There's everything you could ever want. And then you're also like, but also, where's the things that I want? Like, I'm so confused. It's such a lovely, strange place. Not that Canada's that different, but it kind of is. It's been really great so far, actually. I felt relatively safe, but, someone in a different position than me, I could totally see how they may not have felt as safe on that same journey.
Yeah.
That was such a great answer. I love everything about that. I wanted to, before we close, hit you with some listener questions.
Awesome.
We got I'm just going to hit you with a handful. We got some good ones. But the first question is, do you think wanting an open marriage makes you not loyal?
Oof. That is a stereotype I get hit with a lot. I think that for myself, honestly, this is going to maybe sound trite, it'd be a lot easier to cheat. If I just wanted to have sex with another person, like, I could just go do that. And then obviously you got to deal with like the guilt and all sorts of things with that. But I would say I'm incredibly loyal, and so is Levi, because we're doing this hard thing together and we've chosen each other to do that with. And that is no small feat, and it requires us to constantly check in with each other. So I would say more loyal, because even if someone were like tempted to be like, oh, like I really want to have sex with this other person, and like that might be a catastrophic, conversation for someone else to have in their relationship. And for us, we would go about that in a very thoughtful way, and I think go about it in a way that would honor both of us, I think.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. and this is sort of like a second to that, but how do you guys deal with jealousy?
Ooh, jealousy. Jealousy is a strange beast as well, where feeling, I think trying to label certain emotions as bad and other emotions as good, it can get us into tricky territory. So sometimes when you are experiencing jealousy, this is your body's reaction of saying, there actually might be a boundary that's being crossed here. Let me check in on what that is. So if I'm feeling jealous about something, I need to sit back, and usually I do something that calms me, something that I find pleasurable, like am I taking a bath, am I reading a book, am I cooking bread, like, I don't know, something like that makes me feel good. And then once I land back into my body, I say, okay, is this something about my own insecurities that's coming up for me? Is that what's being triggered? Or is it something that my partner is doing that's creating this jealous feeling? And it's probably about 50-50, but I think the thing with jealousy too is you got to talk about it, because the more that you let it like fester and it makes you like angry or something, just the more blown out of proportion it can get. There's a great term in polyamory where, people are like, oh, I'm feeling a little wobbly, right? So it's not quite fully jealous, but you're like, hey, I'm feeling some tingly feelings that are telling me I might start feeling jealous really soon. And that's a really good way to kind of like, oh, let's like pump the brakes a minute. Let's see where we're at and let's check in. So it happens. Polyamorous people are not immune to jealousy. That definitely still happens.
Yeah.
That makes
I
total
like
sense.
that phrase. I'm feeling a little wobbly.
Yeah.
That's really good. That's very descriptive. I think
Yeah.
everyone knows what you mean.
Yeah.
Right? In any relationship, you're like, oh, I'm just feeling a little, a little, like, I don't know, it's a sound I make for wobbly. It's a little sound.
There you go.
A bloopy bloop, Relatable.
Yeah.
Super relatable.
That is relatable. And I think that you bring up really good points in terms of, again, reinforcing the necessity of communication. I think that any healthy relationship obviously should have communication, but because of the nature of your relational orientation, you're sort of forced into even more communication and
Absolutely.
really, really being self-aware.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. Okay. This last one, and surprisingly enough, no one really had questions about bisexuality. They all want to know about your open marriage.
Fair. That's fair.
I'm going to kind of merge two of them, which is like the best way to learn and try new things sexually, / like how do I go on a sex vacation?
Like maybe a retreat or...
Said I want to grow, explore, and dedicate time
Yeah.
away from daily distractions, maybe with a sex therapist or educator to guide us, like a couples retreat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That'd be amazing. Like a couples retreat would be great. I would also say, I mean, if you have the money to do that, heck yeah. Like make sure the person that you're going to is like certified, like they're actually a therapist, they're actually an educator, not just like, someone who wants to take your money, because that happens too.
for sure.
I would say there's a lot you can probably do at home, or you can go on a vacation, but have that intention set for when you go and do that. Because I think that by intentionally setting aside time to explore sexually, like what a gift you are giving yourself. And I would say really emphasize on exploring your pleasure. Don't emphasize like, I want to try and like orgasm like 4 times in a session. Like the more you add pressure on yourself to orgasm, usually the harder it is to orgasm.
Yeah.
So the more that you're like, okay, I'm gonna start by, maybe I have like a sex toy or a vibrator, or maybe it's just like a full body massage. How am I really tapping into those things that bring me pleasure? Like bodily pleasure, something that's like exciting for like your brain. Maybe there's food involved, whatever it is. If you can focus on that, and if you start carving out time at home, and then if you really want to have a dedicated weekend to do that, I mean, it really depends on where people live. Like I just heard about this great like sex educators camp, but they also offer, like couples retreats and things like that. Wow. If people want to go and have time to explore different things in like a safe way. Therapist is also great for that, right? A sex therapist to be like, these are the things that I'm dealing with, or how do I build intimacy or sexual like pleasure? Like they can give you some great tools like specifically for you, And then you can go away and decide if you want to go have a weekend alone to explore that. You want to have an evening to yourself. But carve out time for pleasure in whatever space that looks like, and however amount of money you want to spend on that. Because you don't need to buy all the fancy things. You probably have a hand or a shower head or something. Like,
Or like
Right?
hot tip, Target has some great vibrators for very affordable. So
really,
I'm like,
that's great.
people,
See?
you got to go check it out. Especially like ladies, if you don't have a vibrator, go get one. You'll be so happy.
Yeah, America's amazing. Target, wow. Like, you could just go to Target. I love it.
Oh, Target is amazing.
Target knows what's up.
Target is
I love it.
its own thing.
Its own pleasurable experience.
man.
Right?
Like, that's the way to get you
Speaking
in the
of
mood.
pleasure, if
right
you want to go
there.
on a sex vacation, start at Target.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Load up at Target.
Get some new pillows.
That's
few
like a new ad for
candles.
them. Target, the mecca for all your sex vacation needs.
Get a vibrator.
We'll hit the bullseye.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Start doing their marketing now.
It's like I work in marketing.
You're welcome, Target. I mean, I know you're listening. You're welcome.
Yes, I'm sure the
Yeah.
CEO of Target is listening to this and they want to hire us for
Absolutely.
all
Well,
their marketing
not the CEO,
needs.
obviously, but definitely the CMO.
Yeah, the
Definitely.
CMO.
Yeah.
Marketing department. Anyways, awesome. Thanks for answering those quick fire little questions from our listeners.
And thanks to our listeners
yeah.
for sending them in.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, of
Again,
course.
guys, if you ever want to like send us questions or tell us what you want to hear from us, reach out to us. We're on Instagram.
Let us
We're on
know.
all the places. Anyways, we just got to remind them in case they forgot.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, Leah, it has been such a joy to talk to you about all these things. And as we're starting to wrap things up and come to a close, unfortunately, we need to ask you a question that we ask all of our guests. It is the question, the woman being question. We want to know from you, what does the phrase woman being mean to you?
I love it's like the great equalizer that you ask all of us this. I'm glad. I'm glad. Woman being to me feels like such a beautiful and expansive way to recognize the power that women hold. And I want to be really clear that when I think about the term woman, I'm not just thinking about like those who were born with a uterus, who have boobs, who whatever, like people who identify as women. And it's really important to say like trans women are women, right? There are a lot of non-binary people who still sometimes, identify with women or have a sense of womanhood within them. And wouldn't it be better if we all recognized the energies of femininity and masculinity and androgyny that's in all of us? But we live in a world where that's not the case, where patriarchy and misogyny are very truly well and alive and doing their thing. So woman being to me feels like showing up authentically in a world that doesn't want you to do that wants you to conform to other people's ideas of what it means to be a good woman or a proper woman or whatever that is. And that's going to be different for each of us. But the more that you are able to live authentically as your own woman being, like what a gift to yourself, but also to all those other people around you. Like you are going to have such a huge impact and be a role model to others if you are able to authentically be your own woman being and whatever that means for you.
Good stuff.
That was a good one.
We've never had a bad answer, so
Okay.
just another one of the great ones.
Oh, good. As I wipe my sweat, I'm like, yeah, whew, okay. I think I'm okay.
I love that idea of, I feel like it alludes to the idea that the more that people are whole, the more that people are living into their fullest selves, the more that our society is bettered. The more that we have equity and we're able to reach a more idyllic like society. So the idea that of women showing up fully as they are, whatever that looks like, because womanhood is so expansive, the more that we're able to, grab hold of that power, grab hold of our voices, grab hold of who we are, the more that everybody benefits. So love it.
Thank you for asking that question too. I think it's so easy to kind of create I don't know, like you hear the title of the podcast, you're like, oh, I like that. And you're like, but why? Let's talk about that. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, it's actually one of my favorite things to hear everyone's definitions because they are all so different. And I think that's part of the beauty of it. So, all that to say, Leah, we have heard so much great stuff from you, so much good information. You are obviously such a knowledgeable woman. You have really thought critically about these things. And I'm sure that some of our listeners probably want to learn more about how to come into their own sexuality or about what it means to be somewhere on the queer spectrum or to have a different kind of relationship than the norm, or just how to know more about their sexual health because there's a huge disparity in sex education. And so, Leah, what resources do you have for the folks out there?
Oh, well, I mean, my first totally shameless plug is my podcast. Oh, it's called The Love Doctor, but not even necessarily because, I like to think that I'm just the facilitator of these conversations because I bring on experts in the field. Like if you're interested in learning about gender identity, polyamory, about race, about, kink, so many other things, you get to hear from some leading people, from around North America who really know their shit and they share their work. I will also say that Come As You Are by Dr. Emily Nagoski, huge, impactful book I have read. My partner has read. That's just a great book to kind of understand our sexuality more generally and to realize that, we're not broken in any way. And I will also say that if you're interested in learning about more like medical side, but like from a fiery, intense advocate, Dr. Jen Gunter, she wrote the Vagina Bible and also the Menopause Manifesto. She's amazing. And if you follow her on Twitter or Instagram, you just watch her take down people who are sharing misinformation, particularly about women's bodies around folks with uteruses, folks with vulvas. And she is fearless. And, all of this bullshit like, oh, I need to like wash my vagina with soap or blah, or like eat certain things so I taste better. Nah, she is not there for it. So a lot of really powerful, beautiful women who I would just say, if you're interested in reading, watching, or you could just watch Sex Education. Great show.
Thank you. Did you see
best.
that Daniel Levy is cast for the next season?
Is he really?
Yes, I cried.
Oh, and he is a Canadian legend. That's the only thing I have in common with him. And I'm like, we're queer and we're Canadian. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to claim that. Yes. So, if you haven't watched Schitt's Creek, what a beautiful...
Schitt's Creek is so good.
Right?
So good.
An idyllic world where like David being queer... Not a big deal.
There's a way he explains it in one episode about wine, I think is how he references it. And he's saying I think his friend Frankie maybe is asking him if he's gay or not or what he is. And he was like, well, it's like wine. Like sometimes I like red wine and sometimes I want a white wine. But... I like wine. Like he's like, period. And I think that's about how it goes. And I loved that explanation from him.
Yeah, he just did that so beautifully. I felt very seen watching that episode. I was like, oh yeah, Dan Levy, you understand. And sometimes I want a rosé, and that's just what it's like.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Awesome. We will also have all those resources linked for you guys, and we will have a link to the Love Doctor podcast so that you can follow Dr. Leah Tidey, and so that you can hear more from her and from the amazing people that she interviews. But all that to say, I think that's everything.
Yeah.
We're coming to a close. Thank you so much. No, I really, really enjoyed that. That was such a fun and fascinating conversation. I feel like I've been on the road and been full how do I survive on the road? And so I felt like I landed back into my passion, which was really lovely to chat with y'all.
Oh, we're happy to provide that for you. But woman beings, thank you so much for listening and following along with us on this episode. I hope you got lots of good things out of it, because I know that I did. And all that to say, we are going to wrap this one up. If you're not already, make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast and that you give us a review. And,
5 stars, 5 stars.
5 stars, maybe. No pressure, whatever you want, but maybe 5. And then other people will be able to find the podcast, and we'll be able to interview other amazing people like Dr. Leah Tidey here. So we will catch you guys in another episode next week. And I'm just going to land the plane now. Bye.
We'll see you later, guys.
Sometimes it's hard to end.
It's so hard. It was too good to end it chilly.